Hello, hello. And so it begins. May I say at the outset, for me, there's no place like home. There's no place like home. It is so nice to be back in my home and normal studio, at least for a couple of days. I know this week I will be adhering to my normal schedule, although I must confess, as the new year gets underway, I am feeling rather rusty. And the way that I know that I am rusty is that I made some notes last night about today's program. And when it came time to type in the telephone number, the telephone number that people dial to participate in this program, the 855-486-1776, I recorded it incorrectly. And I beat myself up last night. I said, do you know how many times I say that number? But I really don't say that number because that number flashes on people's dashboard monitor. And frankly, we never want for calls.
Oh, so you excused it right away.
But it was a bit unsettling. It was a bit unsettling to know that I had recorded the incorrect number.
Would you use the old number? What did it just?
Just some amalgamation of things that made no sense. Yeah,
well,
some combination of like my home telephone number and a little bit of the studio number, but nothing that made total sense. I survived double duty at the end of the year and then had just a couple of days because I worked for CNN through the 27th, I guess, of maybe it was even the 28th of December. And then I had just a couple of days to get my stuff together. And
was it fast and furious? I know you.
It was fast and furious, and things were thrown out, and other things got organized, and but it felt so good because that's what I most needed. It's not that we went anywhere. It's not that we did anything extravagant. Me personally, I just needed a couple of days to get it all together. I wish I'd had more time. I feel like I was 3 or 4 days shy of what I really needed. But anyway, I'm happy to be back, and it'll be a good news week, so it'll be a nice way to get things rolling again. We'll catch up on the personal updates a little bit later in the program. I should also say at the outset that one thing that transpired while we were away is that cameras were installed in the home base studio here outside of Philadelphia. So for those fans of going to my YouTube channel, where we post usually one element of the radio program per day, it might be an interview, it might be a commentary, it might just be some back and forth that I have with TC, but you ought to soon notice a real enhanced image of what people are seeing.
There's a lot going on in here.
I know.
It's confusing,
isn't it?
Yes, it is. But it's all good.
It is all good.
Yeah.
And it'll look great. TC, nice to see you. Hope you had a nice break. 10 fingers, 10 toes. The same with Dan. I can't see his fingers or his toes.
Oh, yes.
At least not yet. But hope you had a nice break, Dan, and you're ready to rock and roll.
I did. Ready for 2022, but had a good week last week. Also, with big thanks to Maz and Steve Scully. We had fun together.
Maz and Steve Scully were excellent. So, too, were the 2 days of book club presentations. I myself listened to the program often. I would dip into Maz, dip into Steve, listen to some of those book clubs, and I was just immensely proud of what went on here in my absence. And I'll tell you something else that I was thrilled about is that because the Smerconish.com newsletter has taken on such significance and has nearly 60,000 daily subscribers. It's, there's no longer, I think a year ago, we were like just dark for a week, but we weren't dark for any time period.
Not for a second.
Not for a second. Survey questions every day. A lot of activity taking place. And as I speak, James Meadows, who is our full-time editor, is trapped in the Netherlands. But nevertheless, back to editing. B. Foreman was filling in for him. She's a Penn student, a Penn senior, journalism major.
She did a tremendous job.
A lot of moving parts.
And James doesn't even have to get up early now. I mean, it's perfect. He might stay there.
James is asymptomatic but had COVID. He's fine, but because he's got to go through the testing protocol to come back to the United States, he's there for a few days. But much to our advantage, he's 6 hours ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I woke up to emails from him. I was like, hey, good morning.
It worked out well. If he were 6 hours behind, we might have had an issue. So, ladies and gentlemen, the new year begins with a big news week. Thursday, hard to believe, Thursday is the 1-year anniversary of January 6th. It's going to be hard to avoid that commemoration this week. I know that CNN will be all over it. In fact, I think CNN is going to be all over noting the anniversary of January 6th virtually every night this week. And not to be outdone, Donald Trump himself will have a presser on January 6, 5 p.m. Eastern Time from Mar-a-Lago. And I'm sure that people will be hunkered down in their respective media cells and outlets as we remember what transpired a year ago. Do you know that more than 700 people have been charged in connection with January 6, and many of those cases are now in the punishment phase? The Associated Press had really good coverage of where things stand in a macro sense for those who stormed the Capitol a year ago this week. We posted that link at the website, Smerconish.com, and it's in the newsletter. But here are some of the data points. 705 people have been arrested in connection with the events of January 6. 71 folks have been sentenced for riot-related crimes. They include a company CEO. This is all according to Axios, an architect, an Air Force colonel, now retired, a gym owner, a former Houston police officer, and a University of Kentucky student. So quite a cross-section. 71 have been sentenced. 31 defendants have been sentenced to prison or are already serving in jail. 22 received sentences of 3 months or less. 56 of the 71 pled guilty to misdemeanor counts of parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building. 3 rioters charged with assaulting police officers got prison terms ranging from more than 3 years to just over 5 years. Is the most significant sentence to have been handed down for the events of over a year ago. Something else that caught my eye just in the last 48 hours with relevance to the January 6th anniversary is this. It was a survey from the Washington Post and the University of Maryland revealing, think about this now, that about 1/3 of Americans believe violent action against the government is sometimes justified. Let me say it again. About 1/3 of Americans believe that violent actions against the government is sometimes justified. When I first saw that data and when I first read the survey, I was alarmed by the number. I should say that number, just for comparative purposes, in the mid-90s, I think it was 93 or 95, when Americans were asked the same question, is violence ever appropriate against your own government? Only 13% said that it was. The number is now 34%. So something has changed, and I was shocked when I saw that data. And then I decided, you know what? I think I'm in that category. Like, at first I was thinking a full third of Americans believe that violence can be warranted against the government. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, I think I'm in that category. Let me explain, and you will tell me whether you too are in that category. I am mimicking today at my website the survey question that was used by the Washington Post and the University of Maryland because I want to see our results, the community that listens to this program or visits my website on a daily basis to participate in survey questions or subscribes to the newsletter. I want to see whether our over-under, how it compares to the 34% who told the Washington Post, yeah, I think sometimes it could be warranted. Here's the literal reading of the question. Do you think it's ever justified for citizens to take violent action against government, or is it never justified? When I first heard the question, And in view of the aforementioned January 6th anniversary, I made an assumption that I now believe to be wrong. In other words, I assumed that people were answering the question and were justifying the behavior of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. In other words, when I heard, okay, what percent of Americans think that violence can be necessary against their own government, I thought it's 34% of people who agree with those who stormed the Capitol. But that's not how people answered the question. In other words, in the roughly 1/3 who said that violence can be justified against the government, you had some people who thought those who stormed the Capitol were justified, but you had others who I think were looking at the end game and saying to themselves, if they had succeeded and they had stopped the certification of the Electoral College and Donald Trump remained in office, notwithstanding the election outcome, and the military supported him staying in office, would I then believe that violence against our government was warranted? And I think that a number of people who answered the question affirmatively were coming at it from that perspective, which is the perspective I was coming at it from. In other words, I am a believer in the rule of law. I want to follow the rule of law. We have a process. In the end, the process worked on January 6th. In the end, courts heard evidence, made rulings about claims of election fraud. And in the end, it was ugly, but the process worked. The process is the rule of law. But what if the rule of law had been thwarted and Trump had been able to stay in office as a result of that? Politico, covering this issue, said, this is bad. Roughly 4 in 10 Republicans and independents, I'll come back to that in a moment, say that violent action against the government is sometimes justified, according to this startling new survey that I am describing for you. Again, the number is 34%. Now, this is, I think, very telling of the point that I was making a moment ago, where it's not just Republicans supportive of Trump who comprise the 34%. No. Because when you break it down, the survey finds that 40% of Republicans, ready for this? 41% of independents and 23% of Democrats say violence is sometimes justified. I argue to you that the 40% of Republicans are not answering that question in the same way as the 41% of independents. The 40% of Republicans are thinking, I imagine, the election was stolen. Those who stormed the Capitol were justified. That violence against the government served a purpose. And I would argue that the 41% of independents who are looking at it are coming at it a different way and saying, hey, if that attempt at a coup had succeeded, it might have necessitated violence to overthrow an illegitimate president. There's more bad news in polling data. I don't want to get off track from talking about the violence question, but a new CBS YouGov poll finds that 68% of respondents see the January 6 attacks as a harbinger of increasing political violence, not an isolated incident. Sadly, I'm in that category as well. I'm part of the 68%. There's 12% of the country, one more data point if I may, there's 12% of the country and a fifth of Donald Trump's 2020 voters who want Trump to fight to retake the presidency right now, not waiting for the next election. Think about that. 12% of the country, a fifth of Trump's 2020 supporters want that game on right now. But back to the Washington Post and the question of, is violence ever justified? Okay, so do you think it is ever justified for citizens to take violent action against the government, or is it never justified? 34% overall of U.S. adults say justified. 23% of Democrats, 41% of independents, 40% of Republicans. For historical comparison, I was right. It was 1995 where the number was just 13%. So we've gained, 20 or so points on that issue just since the mid-90s. Now, this is really interesting. There was then a follow-up open-ended question asked by the Washington Post and the University of Maryland, where they said this: under what circumstances would it be justifiable to take violent action against the United States government? And they grouped these answers together. Again, because it was open-ended, they had to try and assign categories to the respondents. 22% of people who responded, this was the plurality, this was the most numerous response, said violence can be necessary against our government when government violates or takes away rights or freedoms and oppresses the people. So those answering affirmatively the question of, is violence ever necessary or appropriate? A fifth of them, round numbers, 22% said, yeah, when the government takes away rights or freedoms. Now, to me, that sounds rather conservative or Trumpian. I think that the people who stormed the Capitol view themselves as rebelling against a government that was taking away rights or freedoms. But the next most popular answer, 15%, government no longer a democracy, becomes a dictatorship or coup, and the military takes over. See, that's the scenario I was responding to. That sounds to me like people who believe if the military had involved itself in January 6th, if the military had supported what Trump was seeking to do on January 6th, then I think you've got 15% saying this is justification for violence against our government. How about this? Government violates the Constitution. 13% said, well, that's the justification to use violence against the government. But what does that mean? Government violates the Constitution. I think that's in the eye of the beholder. Are those 13% thinking the election was stolen in violation of the Constitution? Or are they anticipating, what if Trump had thwarted the counting of the Electoral College ballots? When I work my way through the continuum of responses to the question of in what circumstance would violence be appropriate, I was curious to see how many justify their belief that violence is sometimes necessary by looking at communism or socialism. That was only 4%. That was only 4%. I thought that number would have been much higher among the people who believe that sometimes it's necessary. But it's interesting, right? So here's the question that I ask of all of you. In what circumstances would you say citizen violence against the government is warranted, if ever? And my answer is to be deferential to the rule of law. Deferential to the belief that we have a process. The process has to be followed. Violence should never be justified if the rule of law is being followed. But what if there's an election and a president refuses to honor the outcome of the election and the military then supports that president? I know, lots of ifs there. And some of you are saying, well, that sounds really far-fetched, although in view of what happened a year ago Thursday, does it really? But in that case, that's where I come in under the 34%, because that's where I could justify violence to remove a president who lost an election fair and square, but is nevertheless being kept in power by military forces. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a coup, which is how I get into the 34% or roughly one-third category. So what about you? Call me. The correct number of the program is the same as it's ever been. 855-486-1776. One other note, if I may, in terms of how people regard all this data. 60% of Americans, same survey, Washington Post and the University of Maryland. And by the way, I posted on the website the actual survey. So you can go and look at the questions. It's question 12 and 13, if you're curious, that I'm drawing significance from. And it's in my Twitter feed right now as well. 60% of Americans say that Donald Trump bears a great deal or a good amount of responsibility for the insurrection. Well, that's interesting, right? A majority of Americans say that Trump bears a great deal of responsibility. But when you go into the crosstabs and you look at Republicans, it's 72% of Republicans, 83% of Trump voters say he bears just some or none at all in terms of responsibility. So as we approach the January 6th anniversary, we're all dug in terms of how we look at the significance of that day. 68% of Americans say there's no solid evidence of widespread fraud, but 30%, that's roughly a third, think that there is. And 62% of Republicans say, no, there's evidence of widespread fraud from the 2020 election. 7 in 10 Americans say that Biden's election was legit. That leaves 3 in 10 who say that it was not. And then one last thing, I'm not sure what to make of this. On the media, there's little difference in perception depending on which cable news source people watch. Those who watch Fox News and those who watch CNN have almost identical views about how they feel about democracy today. In both cases, 6 in 10 have pride in America's democracy, while those who watch MSNBC, just over 6 in 10 are positive. I said that a little bit jumbled, but hopefully you got the message. Ladies and gentlemen, the question that I'm asking today is whether you believe it's ever justified for citizens to take violent action against the government, or is it never justified? I have given you a scenario where I find it could be justified, and now you'll call and tell me what you are thinking.